On the topic of American intervention in Latin America, we previously talked about Honduras. Now let's talk about Guatemala. Until about 1944, Guatemala was ruled by a series of dictators who felt that the key to strengthening the Guatemalan economy was to simply sell out the country to multinational corporations such as the United Fruit Company, or as it's known today. One of these dictators is Manuel Estrada, who granted significant concessions to the United Fruit Company, and these were things like tax exemptions, land grants, often at the expense of indigenous people who had their lands dispossessed, and also things like the control of the nation's railroad systems. In fact, selling out Guatemala to the United Fruit Company is something that all these dictatorships had in common, and this is something that would lead to the significant increase in power, both politically and economically, of the United Fruit Company in Guatemala. And this is especially true for the administration of the dictator Jorge Ubico, under which the United Fruit Company grew to be one of the largest land-owning organizations in the country, owning more land than any other individual, group, or organization in all of Guatemala. And much of this land either went uncultivated, underdeveloped, or completely undeveloped. This is land that the United Fruit Company simply held onto and did nothing with. And under his dictatorship, the United Fruit Company also had control of most of the nation's railroad systems, the electricity producing facilities of the nation, and as well as most of its ports. And any protest by the people of Guatemala against the growing influence of the United Fruit Company, their repressive labor practices, or against the dictatorships in control was often met with violent repression by the Guatemalan government. For instance, under the Estrada regime, United Fruit Company workers went on strike in protest of not just low wages, but poor working conditions, at which point the United Fruit Company petitioned the government of Guatemala, Estrada's government, to send in the military, which Estrada obliged, sending in death squads into workers' camps where they fired indiscriminately, killing workers who were striking. Now, I want you to think about that. These were workers who were fighting for better living conditions, who were slaughtered at the behest of their employer. And this was done by a government that should have been looking out for their best interests, but instead was doing the bidding of multinational corporations in their territory. So finally, after years of dictatorships, repressive regimes, of the dispossession of indigenous lands in favor of the United Fruit Company, in response to poor working conditions and the lack of labor rights, the people of Guatemala began to protest and began to rise up against the dictatorship of Jorge Ubico. And this marked the beginning of the 1944 Guatemalan Revolution, which started with pro-democracy protests led by university students and labor organizations such as labor unions. And so this unrest and these pro-democracy protests ultimately led to the resignation of Jorge Ubico, although it didn't get better because all he did was appoint a three-man military junta to take over the nation that ultimately continued to push the same repressive policies that his administration was implementing. And that is until the junta was overthrown on October 1944 in a coup d'etat that was led by Jacobo Arbenz here, which ultimately led to the nation's first free and fair elections in years. And taking the presidency in a landslide victory was Guatemala's first democratically elected president in decades, Juan José Arevalo. And his presidency led to several social reforms, such as the implementation of a literacy campaign, the implementation of almost universal suffrage, free, fair elections, and the implementation of a minimum wage. Of course, this stepped on the toes of the United Fruit Company, but the toe stepping wouldn't stop with Arevalo because at the end of his presidency, the next democratically elected president was the leader of the 1944 coup against the military junta himself, Jacobo Arbenz, who continued the same progressive policies in Guatemala in favor of the Guatemalan people. During his presidency, President Arbenz promised to lessen the influence of foreign corporations over Guatemalan politics and turn Guatemala into a modern capitalist state. And one of the ways that he was going to go about implementing this was through the implementation of a land redistribution policy called Decree 900. What this decree did was it expropriated unused lands, such as some of that underdeveloped and uncultivated land that was held by the United Fruit Company, and it redistributed it to Guatemalan peasants so they can start farming for themselves, using it to, get themselves out of poverty, start working for themselves. Now, it should be noted that at this time in Guatemala, 70% of all arable land in Guatemala was held by 2% of the population. And this includes corporations such as the United Fruit Company. And those who were having their assets expropriated were being compensated through government bonds. Now, despite the fact that they were being compensated for the land that was being confiscated for the purpose of redistribution, these wealthy landowners, both Guatemalan oligarchs and multinational corporations like the United Fruit Company, were pissed. The United Fruit Company in particular was especially pissed off by having their land expropriated because they had understated the value of their land holdings in a 1952 tax assessment, and they had done this for the purpose of attempting to reduce their tax burden. So they understated the value of their land holdings so that they would limit the amount that they would have to pay in taxes. However, this also had the effect that they were compensated for their stated value. So the Guatemalan government took 40% of their land holdings for a relatively low price. The United Fruit Company was pissed. They were pissed over what they saw as the Arbenz administration challenging them not just economically, but politically. And so they began a propaganda campaign to paint the Arbenz administration as communist. Remember, this is during the Cold War, so communism's scary. And while beginning their propaganda campaign against the government of Guatemala, the United Fruit Company also began to petition the American government to intervene. And so the American government did intervene, first under the Truman administration, under Operation Fortune, then continuing under the Eisenhower administration with Operation PB Success. And this was an operation by which the United States Central Intelligence Agency began to train, arm, and fund right-wing rebels in Guatemala led by Carlos Castillo Armas. The CIA then began to work on a campaign to isolate Guatemala internationally by exaggerating the communist influence in the country and painting the government as being under communist control. They also began psychological warfare campaigns within the country, such as through radio broadcasts, where they were spreading anti-government misinformation, as well as spreading misinformation about anti-government activities within the country by far-right militias. By exaggerating that the right-wing guerrillas were more successful than they actually were, because initially right-wing militias weren't really successful militarily. But it didn't matter that far-right insurrectionists were faring poorly militarily because this psychological warfare campaign was having the desired effect. It was demoralizing the Guatemalan military as well as the Guatemalan people. And ultimately, it was a combination of the CIA's psychological warfare campaign, the right-wing insurrectionists that they funded, aerial bombardment by CIA assets, often being flown by right-wing mercenaries hired by the CIA, as well as the threat that the United States would invade Guatemala should the Castillo rebellion failed, that ultimately led to the resignation of Arbenz and led to a successful coup by the right wing. This would ultimately lead to the end of representative democracy in the country with the installation of a far-right dictator backed by the United States. Once Castillo came into power as Guatemala's dictator, he began to arrest his political rivals, often having them executed. He began to ban opposition parties, as well as assassinating anybody that might stand a chance at being a threat to his leadership, if you could even call it that. And with him in power, Castillo began to reverse a lot of the progressive policies that were passed by the two previous democratically elected presidents, including repealing, for the most part, Decree 900 and returning a lot of that expropriated land back to organizations such as the United Fruit Company. So this 1954 American-backed coup in the country ultimately led to the end of democracy in the country, as well as returning it to the hands of corrupt authoritarianism and leading to years of civil war and eventually the genocide of the Maya people in the country. And all of this to protect American economic interests. All of this for a fruit company. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more videos like this, consider supporting the channel by joining the Patreon.